the Joint Planning Board, Kingston Historic Landmarks Preservation Commission, and Heritage Area Commission special meeting. We will begin the meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance. The flag is behind the screen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, we're going to start out with introductions of the three boards. We'll start with the Planning Board. My name is Wayne Platt Jr. I'm the chairman. We also have Robert Jacobson, Mary Jo Wiltshire, Matt Gillis, and we have Suzanne Cahill, who is the planning director. Kyla Dide is the assistant planner, and we have senior clerk Donna Brady. We have Julie Edelson Safford, Alderman Reynolds Scott Childress. Is Patrick O'Reilly here, Alderman O'Reilly? Okay. They are Common Council liaisons. We also have Danielle Gartenstein, the Assistant Corporation Counsel. And I'm going to hand it off to Historic Landmarks, Mark Grunblatt.
Hi, I'm Mark Grunblatt. I chair Historic Landmarks Preservation Commission. The commissioners here this evening are me, Hayes Clement directly to my right, Peter DeMuth over here, and Andrea Putz to my left. And now off to Heritage Area.
My name is Hayes Clement. I'm the chairman of the Heritage Area Commission. With us tonight from the commission are Bonnie Rutsky, who's our vice chair, Abigail Robin, Bernie Matthews. I think that's it.
Okay, thank you. Some housekeeping issues. Exits are at either side of the council chambers. If there's an emergency, we're going to use the stairs and not the elevator. Bathrooms are to the door to my right. I ask folks to silence their cell phones, and if there's a conversation that needs to happen, there are two conference rooms that you can take that to. And we ask that folks respect the speakers. We'll begin tonight with the open public speaking. It's a 15-minute allocation time. Doesn't necessarily have to do with anything that's on our agenda. Just wanted to let folks know that any comments tonight are not going to be part of the official record, as this is not a public hearing. It also is not going to be a question and answer session between the public, the applicant, and the board members. And I ask folks to please limit their time at the microphone to 2 minutes. Is there anybody wishing to speak at this time? Hi, you just made it just in time. Come on up. We switched it up a little bit. I don't know if you heard what on your way up the stairs. Anything that's said tonight is not a public hearing, so it's not part of the official record, okay?
I know. Sorry. And I'm actually just here to submit some comments on behalf of Marissa Marvelli, who couldn't be here, and I am happy to just give them to you. They have some...
Can you just please introduce yourself?
I'm sorry. Hi, Sue. I'm Sarah Wenk. I live at 150 Main Street in Kingston. She just sent some notes and some images that she wanted to share with you. And that's,
Okay.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you. Anybody else? Please don't make me pronounce your last name. Go ahead, Getty, for the record.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Getty Schwenk, and I'm a a neighbor, uptown neighbor, very proud of the area, and I made comments about the Kingstonian project, which are part of the record, and I appreciate your paying attention to those. I pretty much stick to what I said then. In projects like this, nobody gets everything they want. The developer doesn't, the town, the community doesn't, the opponents don't. But what you hope for is a project where you can have something that works for everybody, that is okay. And I think we're sort of searching for that here. You saw the SHPO comments that were made, and I mostly agree with them, but I don't think we should kind of follow everything SHPO wants, nor should we try to defy them just for the hell of it. I think that there's again, a ground where we can make the project more consistent with the neighborhood and what it stands for. And it's a delicate matter because we've got a developer who is very keen not to lose money, to make money. And you've got a community that's really concerned about its character, where it's going in the future, and just the general feel of it. I love it there. It's great. So how do you get there? Well, in my comments, I didn't try to make the project smaller. I said, well, how can you make it better? And there are various design possibilities that I'm really glad that the planning board seemed to pick up on in your comments. I'm no expert in the traffic patterns. I confine myself to the visual aspect of it for the most part, and the community character part of it. You know, that's the part that I'm familiar with. And I do think that that's where improvement is needed. But as I say, I didn't try to make the project smaller because that basically makes it more difficult to have the project happen. So I said, what the best outcome would be, they get the number of units they want, but the project looks like it fits into the neighborhood. And there's a long way to go to get there, but I think it's possible, and I don't think it's a matter of just of money. Because I do think that there are improvements that will not increase the cost of it, but if they do in a limited way. I even suggested the possibility of a couple more units in exchange for some of these improvements. Like, I'm not sure I like the idea of the front end of it having honest materials and fitting in with the neighborhood, and the back end facing the Kingston Plaza just be kind of what it is. I think improvement is possible there too. But I think what you need really is people who are listening to each other, who are talking to each other. And I'm a little bit upset by the tenor of the conversation that has taken place on both sides. I think that just saying we're against it no matter what, and we're going to find new ways of opposing it, isn't the right way to go. But saying that these are our financial parameters and we can't give an inch doesn't make sense, particularly if you've not really seen the financial parameters. I think that more information sharing is needed, and then we can see if we can get together. I, for one, can live with the project or without it, but I can't live with a bad project. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Getty. Anybody else? Okay, we're closing the public speaking portion. We will now reopen the public speaking portion.
I just want to, hi, Tanya Garment, 102 Wirt Street. Just want to remind you that the HLPC did put in comments early on that were I hope that in the end will be considered as official, because they should be. There's no valid reason for them not to be considered as part of the official record. The HLPC's comments were made before they were made. They tried to get it on the agenda the month before. It was announced publicly that they were to be on the agenda the month before. They discussed it the month after. They put their feedback in for whether the planning board should be lead agency. There's absolutely no reason that their comments should not be considered for the seeker process. And I also wanted to say that the local boundaries of the Stockade District go all the way around to the Schwenk side end of the building. The HLPC oversees that, therefore, so that should be part of the discussion by the HLPC. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, we are closing the public speaking portion. Okay, moving on to item number 2 is 9-17 and 21 North Front Street and 51 Schwenk Drive. This is under old business, and a portion of Fair Street Extension. That's a lot line deletion of the lands of Herzog Supply Company and the City of Kingston. Section block and lot is 48.80-1-25, 26 and 24.120. Seeker determination, Zone C2, Mixed Use Overlay District. Kingstonian Development LLC is the applicant. Herzog Supply Company Incorporated and City of Kingston are the owners. It's also going to encompass a site plan special permit to construct a mixed-use building with a 420-car garage, 129 apartments, 32 hotel rooms, and 800 square feet of retail space. Okay, so this is a joint meeting between the three boards. The applicants are here, and they will make a this joint meeting is taking place so the applicants don't have to make 3 separate presentations, and the applicants can field questions from all 3 boards under one roof. So at this time, I'm going to introduce one of the principals of the project, Joe Bonura. If you can introduce your team as well. Thank you, sir.
Good evening. Thank you very much. So Joe Bonura here. I have Dennis Larios. I have Mike Moriello, Patrick Page, Frank Campagna. We have Brad Jordan, and then we have Steve McKenzie. And so we are very pleased to be here tonight. We have spent the last 3 weeks, well, we had 3 weeks in a row where we're meeting with each of your different commissions and committees and heard comments. And then we took those comments to heart along with all the other public comments we received. And although we didn't have much time, we only had about a week and a half, we did some pretty significant redesign, which we're happy to show tonight. And what we're going to be showing, I'm going to get Steve McKenzie up here to talk to you about his thinking. Based on all the comments that we've heard, we're going to take you on a little tour. The design images that you're going to see are not by any means final. They are meant to show you where we're going, and I think we've gone a long way. But Steve will get up here and explain things. Is that good? And I'm going to chime in as necessary.
And Joe, these mics are for your team as well here.
I think it's just
the
gonna be
empty
the two of
mics.
You good with this one? Try it. Yeah, it'll just be us for a while, and if we have more questions, we'll get them up here.
Okay to have water on the table? All right, thank you. Appreciate that. So we do appreciate all the comments and the feedback. That does factor into our thinking, and it really does make a difference. So I hope that'll continue. It's great to see this assemblage as a single group, because I do think that makes for a more efficient process for everybody's benefit. So as Joe said, we are going to show you a different direction. Part of this is showing you a little bit about the design process, but also about some of the potential we think the project offers. But it's going to be grounded in some fundamentals, starting with, again, how we view the design process, our philosophy, and also the fundamentals in terms of not only the challenges, but the opportunities this site presents. And I would characterize it really not as a building, but as a development, because there are many facets to how this could take shape. So briefly, we use this as kind of a touchstone. This comes right out of the national guidelines for historic preservation. This is part of the application that was approved, I think, back in '75, and when it was later amended to go back to '65. So again, this is our touchstone. Next slide talks about, from a philosophical standpoint, the key drivers of the design. I said before that context is essential and critical to consider, and hopefully that'll come through when you see our approach. Excuse me, Joe, back one. I also added another quote from Charles Eames, who's a fantastic designer, and again, it touches on the comment I said about constraints. So what's important, again, is that we hear from you whatever your concern or comment is, and we've heard a lot of good comments from everybody. Some, of course, we agree with, others we don't, but that's okay, that's healthy. I think that tension actually leads to a better outcome. It stretches your thinking, if you will. And hopefully we're going to challenge and stretch your thinking likewise in terms of the overall context. So that's a key driver. I did want to mention, and pardon me if I digress a little bit, but I had the benefit of going to a concert in Montreal last night, a symphony concert. It was a Beethoven violin concerto. I've used music a lot as an analogy for architecture, many people do. But Beethoven in particular was noted for endlessly reworking his compositions. He was never satisfied with the eventual outcome. The reason I mention that is, for us, it's very much an evolutionary process as well. So when you look at the images of the building we're going to show you, think of that as temporarily freezing the evolution. We have to do that to convey to you some sense of where this is going. And it's both a blessing and a curse of computer images that they look more finished than they actually are, but we understand the necessity and the value of showing you those kinds of images and the client, because things have to be on track from this point of view as well. So please bear that in mind, and I can't emphasize enough that this is an evolutionary process. It's still early, and we very much want you to be part of the conversation in how this takes shape, okay? I know that there was some question on exactly what the definition is of the historic district, so I took this right out of the application, the original application, and I highlighted the language, first of all, that indicates the boundaries of the historic district, which are really the four primary streets. It mentions the east side of Fair Street as kind of a sub-district historically, and I think that was done somehow under a separate application. And then it also mentions that the definition of the boundaries extends to the back property line of whatever fronts on those four streets. So I know the Schipple letter, which I had the benefit of seeing this week, I do appreciate, Sue, you're forwarding that to Joe and us, makes reference to Fair Street and makes the case for that really being part of the historic context. I do think that's a gray area, but frankly, in our minds, I do think it makes sense, given what this map says, to really consider that as part of what we need to approach from a historic standpoint. So bear in mind, again, that all that's got to be factored by other constraints, like, again, the budget, et cetera. So we're using this, in other words, as kind of a reference point for officially what's considered the historic context versus other elements of the circumstance. Next slide. Excuse me, any questions? Am I off track with what I just said about Mark?
I think you're going to want to double check the city's own definition. I believe the most recent official map came out in 2011.
Okay.
That's why and it's close to what you've got there, but it's not precisely the same, and we want to be working off the same templates.
Okay.
Can someone provide that to us?
Yes.
That would be great. Okay, appreciate that.
And I think that'll work out okay, Mark. I don't see that beaten problem, because what I want to talk about now is it's really a multifaceted site. So I'm going to describe an approach, if you think of this as problem solving, and it is part of the architectural or master planning process, really any design process, as a very fundamental problem solving aspect to it. So what I'm going to do is break the problem down into more manageable, more understandable components so you can see how we constructed our thought process for how to approach this. So when I say multifaceted, obviously North Front Street represents a different circumstance that requires different considerations. The second component is what I just said about Fair Street, and I'm granting the fact that that needs probably a little more consideration from an historic standpoint, but it's also transitional for obvious reasons, as it's a link between North Front Street and clearly Schwenk Drive, which is not really historic in terms of the map, nor can you say it's historic unless you have strong feelings about strip mall architecture and that sort of thing. There's really nothing comparable from an historic standpoint about Schwenk Drive context. And as I said earlier, that presents a very interesting opportunity, if you will. You can call it a dilemma, but I view it as an opportunity for how we approach the problem-solving process. The other aspects of the site are really then the backside of what those three streets create in terms of urban planning. And if you look at Wall Street or typical commercial buildings downtown, they have a facade on the street that's more decorative, obviously a stronger design statement. The other three sides, and I'm oversimplifying, but typically are very simple plain boxes. There's various reasons for that, but the fact of the matter is that is the precedent, and that is a typical strategy for how buildings are designed. Knowing that we have budget constraints, the approach I'm going to show you takes the position that if Fair Street deserves more consideration, we've already said North Front is a priority, we just said Schwenk is a lesser priority, then it stands to reason that as resources permit, we're going to put more emphasis on Fair Street than we've talked about in the past, and less on the other sides of the project. In other words, Schwenk and the backside of the buildings, if you think of Fair Street as a commercial street like Wall Street or North Front. So what I'm going to show you illustrates that kind of mindset. Again, this is not finished architecture, it's conceptual, but it illustrates where this opportunity can start to take you. Okay?
I'm trying to go through the...
So very quickly, I want to walk through the planning fundamentals, the planning chassis, if you will, behind the project, because I think this is very important to understand as a driver for how the whole project is organized. One of the basic challenges, conundrums, whatever you want to call it, that I think everybody is dealing with, whether you recognize it overtly or not, is that by definition, a 420-car parking map is totally out of scale with everything about the Stockade District, and frankly, about this edge of Kingston. But that's the fundamental, challenge here, is how do we address that need? And I think that's a serious need and a valid need. How do we address that and reconcile that with all the other factors, with all the other contextual challenges this project presents? And much of what we've shown you and much of what we're going to show you tonight, again, reflects that reality, but reflects a different way to handle it aesthetically. So in planning terms, we've highlighted in red public elevator banks. There's one here which connects up to the new plaza, and one across the street, which represents handicap access to the bridge across the street. Shippo made a comment about the value of Fair Street being of historic value because of, I think, mid-19th century kinds of activities when there was a railroad yard and I believe a lumber yard in the area. Yeah. I actually like that comment because it gives us something to build on in terms of how we approach the architecture. But I think to say that it has to remain as is for the sake of vehicular and pedestrian traffic is probably short-sighted. And I think what we're trying to do here is separate the two in a way that frankly works better for the city and is a safer circumstance and a more convenient circumstance. And I'll give you an example from the next slide, Joe, if you can show that. Again, we have orange for the housing and the red for the public elevators. We removed the control gates that were shown on the portion of Fair Street that remains. Our assumption is that the parking will be like some of the more current ideas where you simply go and park and you pay at a machine. So I don't see any issues really as far as traffic flow, and this is what I've experienced on recent public parking structures that I've been in, including up in Burlington. So it's a very good circumstance from a traffic management standpoint. So let's suppose that we don't do the plaza. Let's suppose that Fair Street remains as is. What does that mean if you want to do a 420-car parking structure and if you want to accommodate pedestrian traffic in a safe way? I think it creates greater problems. I think it's actually a negative for the city and for the project in that you'll aggravate traffic conflicts for access in and out of the parking structure, both sides of the street, and pedestrian activity if they're using the sidewalk and have no other opportunity to move back and forth. So I view that as a real negative, besides the missed opportunity that the plaza presents. So the next slide shows you, again, how the plaza sets up. I think it's important to keep in mind that in terms of the sight lines, the view corridor that Fair Street represents, I don't feel we're changing that at all. I think that, in fact, has been preserved and better framed by the development on both sides of Fair Street. I think the notion of the bluff, if anything, is better articulated. We haven't erased that. We simply articulated it in a better and more clear manner. So I would not agree that, from that standpoint, the project does not pay attention to, nor does it address the importance of those considerations. The presence of the view corridor and the perception of the bluff or the change in height. So back to circulation. Again, if somebody's coming up the elevator on the Kingston Plaza side of the street and across the bridge, you're crossing at level 3 and you come up a ramp up to the plaza level or level 4. It's all wheelchair accessible, and to me that's a much more appropriate, safer circumstance in terms of pedestrian traffic back and forth across the site, as well as access to the parking structure. The one gentleman here, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Yes, you. Pardon? Robert. You made a comment at the last meeting about the corner entry on Schwenk and Fair Street. That's really a secondary entry, the way the wayfinding circulation sets up here. It's an entry into the lower level of the parking, but we viewed the main vertical connector as really being at the other intersection up by the plaza as being a more appropriate way to handle whatever pedestrian flow comes in that part of the site. Part of this goes to my experience master planning, designing hospitals, which I said are like small cities, and circulation is critical in terms of how you approach those things. So
yeah, I just want to reiterate one thing that Steve's bringing up, and it can get lost, but there a lot of careful thought went into the idea of this plaza. The cars come in under it, and the people stay on top of it. So separating that traffic, separating those 420 cars, which are going to be coming and going multiple times a day, we hope, which means Uptown is vibrant, keep the traffic here and the people up above it, which is a wonderful opportunity to not have that collision, but also create a whole new place. That asphalt that exists in the middle of the road right now can only be enjoyed by cars, and I say enjoyed, if cars enjoy asphalt, but people will be able to enjoy this new gathering place, which is the opportunity that's would be missed if this were to go away.
okay, next slide, Joe. I was in Quebec City a couple summers ago for the tall ships. If you ever have a chance to do that, I would highly recommend it. It was fabulous, but this is an old Quebec. It's the City Hall Plaza, and it shows, in the case of an old historic city, how they were willing to consider a different kind of design for a public space. Interactive fountain, same opportunity that you're presented with here in Kingston by making better use of the Fair Street corridor, in our opinion. So to say that there are no precedents, and by the way, I do appreciate Marissa's comments. I think she makes some very good comments. Obviously, I don't agree with everything, and in particular, don't agree that we simply have to follow precedent in terms of what's done here. I think there are many valid precedents to consider when you look at the larger picture as a planning committee. So Here's an opportunity, here's an historic precedent. There are many around the world. I've had a chance to visit many myself, and I think this reinforces the value of the opportunity. Wonderful, wonderful place to spend time. The kids, the families put on a great show when weather permits, and obviously they have a harsher climate than this part of New York State, which I consider the banana belt compared to where I live in Vermont. So again, I think it's a great opportunity. North Front Street, I'll talk about briefly. This is the same slide you saw before. So again, I've talked enough about the benefits of the plaza as a public space. I just think it offers tremendous value, and this is a rare opportunity for the city to create something that adds that kind of value. And again, it reinforces the view corridor. I'm sorry, Joe, go ahead. So we looked at a couple color options. I know, Mark, you said you would provide some information about the hotel. I don't know if that has any color information or not. We're happy to discuss that with whomever as far as what's appropriate. We have a couple different examples just to illustrate the impact of different color palettes on the character of the hotel. We have 3 different models here, Joe, if you want to go through those. So again, not saying any of these is our final choice. We're trying to illustrate that this is an exploratory process, and we do value your feedback in terms of what you feel is appropriate. Okay?
I'm just going to go back through them one more time.
No, that's okay. I think that's enough. We can come back to that if we
Okay.
need to. So next slide. So this highlights how I view the Fair Street opportunity, because to me it is transitional. It's going from what is really the obvious historic edge on North Front Street to Schwenk Street, which is the obvious non-historic. So right or wrong, it's going to be a transitional kind of zone for the site. So how do we approach that? This is a building where I live in Burlington, where they added on top of an old, beautiful, historic building, converted it to condominiums, and they added a penthouse, which added some additional units. Very successful combination of new architecture with old, done respectively and done appropriately. That's a good illustration of what we have in mind for Fair Street as a transitional kind of approach. There's no precedent for us to literally replicate on Fair other than the side of the Kingstonian, obviously. Nothing on the west side of the street, obviously, since Montgomery Wards came down, and I know the old parking structure offers no value, let's say, to replicate historically. So I think that's a valid precedent, and I show that to you as an example of what I think can be done. This is a little hard to see, but what we're going to study is, first of all, pulling the cornice down a floor from where we had it before at the very top of the 4-story building on Fair Street down to the same level as the majority of the Stockade District. And likewise at the same height as the hotel. I think you can see it looking down this view of the site. So that's altering the scale. What we do at the penthouse level, there's many opportunities, whether we do a French provincial mansard type look or whatever type of approach we look at, whether it's more of a warehouse kind of approach. But there's some great opportunities for how we do that. We modified the balconies because I think balconies have been repeatedly problematic in that it's not an obvious feature in the Stockade District. So we did the same thing we did on the corner brick building to make that a solid wall with punch openings for the first 3 levels. On the top penthouse level, it's simply a railing that occurs at the top. So that eliminates the challenge of how do you make balconies, which are frankly not a historic feature, how do you make that more compatible with the precedent, if you will, of the context, okay? Purposely are not showing you a direct view because you haven't had time to develop that more fully. But conceptually, that's the intent. And I do think that's going more in the direction that everyone's going to be more comfortable with. We have to do that likewise, understanding Joe's constraints. What I said earlier about shifting where we spend dollars is where this shows up on both sides of Fair Street. If we take the approach then that these buildings are like other commercial buildings, it means that we're going to simplify the backside. I think that's okay because my sense is that it's not as critical for the impact and for the context. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So, again, I mentioned this. I think, to me, this is a great precedent for what it creates as an opportunity in our minds So we know about what was there before Montgomery Ward. Not that that's necessarily a precedent we want to repeat. There's an excellent precedent I'm sure you're all aware of in town. The Lace Mill building, in terms of the scale as a brick building, first of all, and second of all, what I like about it is the live-work scenario, because I think that's one of the big benefits of this project. It's enhancing a live-work kind of circumstance. I talked before about sustainable lifestyle. To me, there's nothing better you could do for the city than enhance this kind of opportunity, whatever you feel about the type or cost of housing. So anything that continues this kind of mindset to me is essential and excellent. We talked before, when you look at the site section, about how we handled the scope of the project, and I still feel this is essential and valid. It ties into what I showed you earlier as far as circulation, but there's several reasons why the building on the left, in fact, is a separate building. What I'm going to show you articulates that more clearly as a separate building. From a code standpoint, it's separate because we couldn't build the entire facade as one facade on Schwenk if we wanted to out of wood. We couldn't afford it because the code doesn't allow it. Not to bore you with details, but the way code measures height out of wood is you take the average perimeter grade at the bottom and you measure 70 feet to the height of the building or average height of a gable. We would exceed that if we did that as a sheer wall along Schwenk Drive. So that's a practical constraint, but frankly, the design constraint is we'd rather do this anyway for aesthetic reasons. And this shows the impact of wrapping that 420 parking structure with buildings. So we've taken the approach of saying, okay, let's give this a character of an old mill building, make it look like an old warehouse, whether it was a lumber warehouse Precedent, whatever you want to interpret that as a theme, but use that as a conceptual driver for how we approach this part of the site. The upper part then, which is set back 35 feet, again, we treat as more of a warehouse. We're showing you this in brick. There's research to be done to see whether we can actually do this, not only budget-wise, but site-wise, because Joe talked before about the fact that the site is toothpaste. So there's limitations to how we can do that, but we think there's a chance that at a minimum thin brick could work, but I want to be clear that we don't want to overpromise or overcommit. If we can make it work, I think that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, there's a lot of materials out there that'll accomplish this look, and we have to do a little bit more research. And if this is the look that the larger group feels we should go with, then we have to research what exact material we can use. But picking up on what Steve was saying, the idea of an industrial building or a warehouse that's been converted to more modern use, I think, is the theme that we've heard, and we're trying to reflect that in the new architecture.
You can see a little bit then about picking up on the theme of Fair Street getting the emphasis. I don't know if you can see the east side of Fair Street on the left side of the image where we introduce, again, some of the traditional cornice detail. Down a floor, the balconies are converted to punch openings. We'll create an aesthetic which looks like a series of individual facades, articulating where we have stacked unit types. So I do think there's some authenticity for how that interprets really the architectural chassis, if you will. Showing stone for a base that actually covers, part of the parking structure base on that side of the site, and a three-story building which I think of as like a repurposed loft housing warehouse. One thing I should mention, there's probably another slide, Joe, that shows that better.
It's decided not to change slides on me, so I'm going to have to figure out why.
That's a later slide.
Oops.
That's going all the way back.
Yeah, I'll get it.
Okay.
Sorry, technology.
So it's a very different aesthetic, but it responds, again, to some of the comments we heard, and frankly, some of the comments were contradictory. I heard some people say it's not monolithic enough. Others said it's too monolithic. Ironically, we're showing something that does both. It's less monolithic on Fair Street where it matters, more monolithic from Schwenk where it matters because it's a different circumstance for how you perceive the building. And a simpler articulation makes it easier to perceive and at the same time hide the apparent scale of the building. And it does it in a way that's sympathetic, we think, to the context. Joe skipped ahead to this. Can you go back to the...
That was next.
Okay, yeah. All right, so that's next, that's fine. This shows you, I think, from one of the key views from the plaza, the difference visually in the impact of this approach. You can more clearly read the 3-story building along Schwenk. The building that's set back beyond is different and reads simply as a warehouse behind the building that fronts on Fair Street. Okay? As far as the pedestrian bridge, we look for some precedents that quote-unquote reflect more of Kingston, whatever you think might be appropriate visually for Kingston. So this is a design type for the bridge that we feel fits within the budget, using gusset plates and rivets for the aesthetic, rather than the contemporary kind of expression we had earlier. So when you look at this 3D view, we didn't have time to add the gusset plates and the rivets. Not shown at that level of detail, but simply changing the color and suggesting a different kind of finish on the metal makes the point that we can change the personality of that, like we're changing what we call the liner building on Schwenk to be something that fits in better with the context. Acknowledging that this is Schwenk in the plaza, I still think this goes back to the comment you made, Mark, actually, about how do we create an experience for somebody arriving that's kind of an introductory experience to the Stockade District. So this starts to establish that sort of circumstance, if you will. And there's other ideas, frankly, I have for how we could treat the edge of the pedestrian plaza. I don't know if Joe hasn't heard this yet. I don't know if we could afford to do it, but
That's
frankly...
always scary.
What's that?
That's always scary.
I know. It is scary. I'm not trying to scare you. But if you like the idea of interactive fountain, I think water's a wonderful tool for creating a sense of place. I think every community needs a sense of place somewhere. That's like a fundamental human consideration. Water is a great tool for doing that. One thing we can think about, not saying there aren't challenges, but create also a stream which leads to a waterfall over the edges of that offset. To me, that's one way to create movement and even further reinforce the change in height. A waterfall is a fabulous tool for articulating a change in height. I understand there's no literal historic precedent, but as I said before, there are many precedents all over the world, historic settings, that reflect how valuable that kind of approach is. So maybe out of reach, but that's one of the ideas we've been toying with for what could be done here. That would actually frame the entry to the parking below. I wouldn't go so far as to say that should be a car wash and wash the cars you come in or out. But I suppose there's an opportunity for somebody to make money, perhaps. Perhaps not. Last slide. This kind of goes back again to really the core challenge for the Planning Commission, really for everybody, is reconciling the historic agenda with the larger picture. And I said before that the automobile, to me, is the core issue in how you do that. You know, you're trying to accommodate 420 cars. I said before, in other locations, the way they finesse that to preserve, in the case of Italy, historic cities, is they don't allow the cars to come in. They keep them at the perimeter and they make it convenient, but you walk, which is good from a health standpoint. We're trying to do the same thing here. Quebec City does the same thing. If you go to the historic center, the parking's underground. And in a sense, what we're doing here is underground, but not as literal as how they do it there. But that's the kind of thinking I think is important and valuable for how to best approach the circumstance. And we have a concept we think can be successful. Joe has done some initial pro formas that show it can work, but our job is to balance all the constraints for how this plays out. Okay? But I do think that's the essential challenge for the Planning Commission is look at the larger picture, not just simply the historic picture, because there are urban planning considerations which are very important here, and urban planning opportunities. That goes back to what is said about people and cars, and what is said about taking advantage of really the better good. Okay, thanks. Appreciate your time and this opportunity. Frank has some boards that reflect what we just talked about. So happy to discuss whatever you think we need to discuss, answer questions. Joe, you have anything you want to add?
I think you got it for now.
Okay.
Hang on, I don't know if I can ask.
Okay.
You want to sit down?
Yeah. Sit down.
We're not going to split this
We got it.
Right.
I like what you did with the pedestrian bridge. My thought on that was I was looking to the rail trail bridge that I think it's Route 55 that it
Yeah.
goes over.
Yep.
That's
In
what I
Poughkeepsie.
envisioned, and I was thinking that, because the railroad went through there, this kind of pays an homage to that type of industry instead of having the white,
Right.
antiseptic look to it. So that's
Excuse me, Wayne, we looked at that, and if we could afford it, we would. That's got a different geometry on the framing. It's got the diagonal. That's basically custom fabrication. It's way too expensive.
I wasn't saying mirror it, but
I know.
use some of the same colors and what have you to make to make this happen.
To make it look more like a
Right.
railroad bridge. Well, when you still have the railroad right below.
Give it a
basically.
trestle look. That's
Right.
what I was
Yep,
looking
that's
at.
our thinking.
Yep.
I think that's especially appropriate in light of the former train station being at the bottom of that hill.
Train station actually, where the plaza is now, Kingston Plaza?
It would be back closer to where Aaron Court is, but yeah, that general area.
Okay. Good.
Anyone?
I like the look of the industrial, the building down there, the brick building. I really liked your slide of the old and new blend, how the window details were on that. Is there a way that, I'm sure this isn't the last we'll see what the details will be, but have you considered doing something like that with the window details on this building?
If we can afford it, yes, but again, I think the priority is Fair Street. Tell me if you disagree, but if we do that, that's really what we have in mind for Fair Street. That's really what that slide was intended to illustrate, because I view Fair as the transition between the Front Street side and the Schwenk, and sort of combining both for maybe not so obvious, but for valid reasons, and it works. You can see that it works looking at the image.
Yeah. This design in and of itself, quick numbers, is several $100,000 more
Okay.
than the previous design. And we're going to try to make that work, but when you put a project together like this, there's a lot of drivers. So there's people, and us included, they're very interested in energy efficiency and green building technologies. Well, they all cost money. So there's a trade-off. You can only spend so much per square foot, and you have to figure out where to put it. And so it can't all go into architecture and windows, and it can't all go into green technology, and it can't all go into parking garage, and it can't all go into elevators and waterfalls. There's things that we have to trade on and off in order to keep this project buildable in the Hudson Valley. So it's we want to build a building that we're proud of and that you're all proud of. That's first and foremost. But as was said earlier, not everyone's going to get what they want. And we're going to build a great project, or we're not going to build it at all.
I think the...
No, I'm sorry. Just when you were referencing the trade-off is to focus more on Fair Street, where on Fair Street are we focusing? The building that's facing the plaza, or the buildings that are facing the Fair Street that's now the entrance to the garage?
The plaza. So when Steve was referring to Fair Street, he was referring to Fair Street Extension and the Pedestrian Plaza.
Okay.
So keeping
That's
it...
where you originally had the lattice work that was a transition from one building to the other?
Really the whole length.
Correct. So now he's using the entire length as the transition, brought the cornice down, did punched openings the entire length instead of lattice work, abrupt transition.
Now it's more uniform.
It's more uniform.
Good.
Exactly. And more expensive. But given what we know, or what we think we know about where the boundaries to the historic district are, making the transition further back makes more sense.
I want to add something, a comment again. You made, Mark, about introducing some variety in the entablature and the cornice detail. That's part of what we have in mind too. All we've modeled here are really two versions for a cornice, but we just haven't had time to study that
Let me
enough.
see if I can zoom in on it more.
but it's a good opportunity for sure to do that.
Thank you.
I think the Fair Street improvements are definitely an improvement, but I think the Schwenk Drive elevation is enormously improved. And I do very much like the fact that you're being sort of more contextual with the sort of back of an industrial building, which makes sense with what was there. It also makes a lot of sense with the Senate Garage building. I would like to see perhaps the window openings on the industrial part, if you could make those, instead of two next to each other, maybe one larger and sort of mimic the metal casement windows in the Senate Garage. I think that'd be even better.
Yeah, we can consider that, Hayes. Again, as dollars permit, I don't want to overpromise. It may come down to priorities. Do we do that, or we do more on Fair Street to make sure that's right? So there are always choices we'll have to make, but you'll be aware of that as we go through the process.
And we also check floor plan too. This is always a conflict between
Of course.
exterior architecture.
I get you have 50 things you got to work into one building, but
This
That's
is-
an understatement.
This is likely a demising wall between two apartments.
yeah, I get it.
So mulling the window together where there's a wall separating it might prove impossible.
But even
we'll
if
take a look
they're
at it.
variegated and some are larger and some small, I think that even adds to the sense that it's actually an old readapted building. The one question I had, I was a little confused on the pedestrian bridge. Is that going to be covered, or it's going to be an uncovered thing, just
Uncovered.
like a?
Uncovered.
I think that's a massive improvement also.
Yeah. As I believe Wayne said earlier, if you look at the bridge that crosses over Route 55 in Poughkeepsie, this is going to look a lot like that.
I'm just going to ask the question, I'm just throwing it out there, but
Yep.
is there a reason for the building along Schwenk Drive, because we keep talking about scale and scope, and obviously the buildings that are up on North Front are much taller, is there a reason that we're holding to that 3-story versus making that industrial building like a 4-story on Schwenk Drive? Because I know the other buildings step back, but I'm just not sure what that roof line and, I mean...
Well, it's best to look at the section, Joe, if you can pull that up. That kind of explains how that works. We're hiding the edge of the parking structure, and it's also an opportunity, obviously, for what's a single-loaded building, meaning a corridor, with units only on one side rather than both sides. Okay?
Talking about here?
Yep.
Yeah, so that front building went up a story, it'd be in front of the other
Correct.
apartments.
Right.
Right.
Obviously, that's too wide for...
Yes.
Correct.
more
You need to have
apartments.
windows in each bedroom in order for it to be a legal dwelling unit. And this allows these basically to be apartments. The area that we've squished in the center here, this will be interior storage space that'll be available to the tenants as well as for the building to function. And so this is a unit facing the courtyard, and this is a unit facing Schwenk Drive. If we were to bring this up a story, we'd essentially create more storage space, but not pick up any more rentable units, and it wouldn't help with the scale. So the idea that, and I really like what Steve did with making this building look like it's two buildings. So it looks now like you have a building here and then a building behind it. If that was up a story higher, it'd be harder. It wouldn't gain us anything, except some more storage and take away from the look. But great question.
The other thing, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Real quick, the element on the left that's sort of covered in front by trees, I think you could stand to actually do a similar language on the right with the structure on the left and break that facade up. It feels a bit like an afterthought just being covered in trees.
Yeah, we haven't had time to address that. Depends on dollars. And I'm trying not to overpromise, but I can't disagree with what you're saying. You know, and that's why I want to say this is a work in progress. To the extent buildings up front on Fair Street have a street side facade, that's a commercial side, and a back side, that's really the warehouse, whatever side. I'm not sure I would go that far and say that about this side facing Schwenk. I think it deserves a little more consideration, as you're saying. So there's several ways we can do that. We'll just have to see, how we find the right balance. But I would agree with what you're saying.
It's also a different circumstance in that there's no dwelling units here. There's just literally parking behind it in a vertical wall. So whereas here it's stepped back and you have this liner building it built in front of it, it reads as it's a separate building. If we were to just cover this with a more expensive material, I don't know if we gain anything other than a change in color, which we can change color, and we can look at it, but the idea was to try to use landscaping and greenery to soften the base of the building. Is that right, Steve?
Yep.
Well, it's not so much just a material change. I wouldn't suggest to just kind of wallpaper it with brick, but if you even, again, did that same response where you stepped the building backwards, then you have that material change very specifically, and it's intentional.
If we did that, we'd lose several units. If we brought it back, see the way the site lays out, this is deeper than this side. So it allows us to step it back. If we did that here, we'd probably give away, I don't know, 4 times 16 to 20 apartments, and that would hurt the economics of trying to pay for the parking structure. So there's that.
Joe, could you
Delicate
pull
trade-off.
up level 4, if
Yeah.
you don't mind, elaborate a bit more on that, because we actually looked at that and thought about it. But there is some room on the back side, I call it the Brad side of the site, because it's convenient. But picking up on what you said, we thought about taking units off the top of that end of the building and moving them to the back side of the Brad side of the site. There's a little bit of room to do that. We haven't studied it, but that would do, I think, what you're saying. It would step the volume in the same way at that end. It wouldn't seem quite so sheer without losing units for Joe. But it's going to take some time to explore that. But I think it's possible to do that. And they would do the same on the backside. You'd have a smaller volume to transition into the taller backside of the building. It may have to be a little wing that, just simply looks like more warehouse, but that's okay. We can still treat the lower scaled end like we're treating what we call the liner building or the brick warehouse on Schwenk. So it's a good observation. So we'll see. Other questions, comments?
The water element?
Water element? You mean
that
the
you're
interactive
planning
fountain?
for the plaza. I'm intrigued by it. I think it could be done really well. I would suggest, rather than a waterfall, you consider a flowing stream indicating the declivity, that we're water flowing downhill, and that would allow you a simpler way to the sound, the steady, inviting nature of water on one side or the other, or however you wanted to do it. My vision has less to I'm trying really hard to come up with one that's local. The one that comes to mind is the Gardens of the Generalife in Granada, but I don't think you want to go to Moorish architecture here.
No.
What do you think of the fountain idea? Do you think we should ditch it, keep it?
I know that it is an open invitation, and there's nothing exactly like it. The closest thing we had is the now defunct fountain in Academy Green, which is much more ornate than this. But the idea of water creating an attraction in a public space is something that Kingston has been used to in the past. I'm not wedded to this linear design, but I'm sure you can make it fit the plaza with, I leave this up to someone with a better artistic eye than mine.
Yeah.
I will say that I think the water feature is a good feature for the project. I think any large metropolitan area that you go to, there's a water feature, and ironically, everybody congregates around it, whether it be cafe tables or benches or whatever they do. I know just from my own personal flipping through Kingston historical books, we had fountains all over Kingston back at the turn of the century, and it was a meeting place. So I think uptown Kingston, the way that the streets are designed right now, it is hard for pedestrians, especially with the canopies, to meet and congregate. And I think by having some type of a water feature, that will attract people to this project and to that pedestrian way, to have some type of a meeting a space. Honestly, a few weeks ago, I was at a doctor's office down in Oakwood, which is nothing more than just square